All right, so welcome again, everyone, to the Phillips Manor Hall History Lecture Series, sponsored by the Friends of Phillips Manor Hall. Tonight we have with us Christopher Minty, whom will be talking about Loyalists in New York. The title of his talk is Unfriendly to Liberty, Loyalist Networks and the Coming of the American Revolution in New York City, which is also the title of his book, which I don't know if you can see in my background. We happen to have some copies here in the Phillips Manor Hall Museum gift shop if you'd like to stop in and get one, or you can also pick one up online. Chris, we're so happy to have you virtually, although we couldn't have you in person. So I am going to go ahead and let you get started. And we're really looking forward to this talk.
Thank you. And thank you, Sarah, for organizing and putting together this event. It's kind of funny because when I was doing the research for this book, and I started at the end, and I was researching loyalists in and around New York. And the way I started was I wanted to find as many loyalists as possible. So I started looking for loyalist petitions and declarations from all across Manhattan and in Queens and Brooklyn, in Westchester. And the first petition that I found was published in Hugh Gaines' New York Gazette, and it was published in James Rivington's newspaper as well. And it was a loyalist petition from White Plains in Westchester. And it was a list of, it wasn't too many people, maybe just over 100 or so. And they were indicating they're protesting against the Continental Congress and its delegates, and they were arguing that they weren't legally elected, and they were supporting the legally elected assemblymen, and they wanted the New York Assembly to lead the protest against Parliament and the Coercive Acts and the overall reorientation of the British Empire. And the first person who signed it was Frederick Phillips III. And I put together a database of all these people, and I found nearly 10,000. So he was number one. So he was listed as number 0001. He didn't appear too much in the research because he was mostly north of Manhattan. But the people who were listed in there, someone like Samuel Seabury, he appears in the book as well. And people who lived on Phillips Manor who also signed, they appear in sort of bits and pieces as well. So Phillips has been someone who's been sort of ever present in my research, and he doesn't appear too much in my talk tonight, but I'm really grateful to be able to speak to virtually at Phillips Manor. So the title of my talk, Unfriendly to Liberty, Loyalist Networks and the Coming of the American Revolution in New York City. And what I want to do this evening is go over how a group of people, a group of New Yorkers became loyalists. And this book and my research, it kind of reorients how we think about the coming of the revolution. Most histories start from the premise of those who became patriots, and it tracks their path to 1775 or 1776. I start from a different angle, and I look at those who became loyalists. First, though, we have to think about where we are. So my book focuses on 18th century New York City. And here you'll see an 18th century cityscape, and you'll see a lot of church spires puncturing the skyline. It's not skyscrapers then, it's church spires. New York was one of the most diverse cities, not only in colonial British North America, but across the British Empire. Throughout the 18th century, New York was establishing itself as one of the most important colonial cities in the empire. It surpassed Boston in terms of population and trade, and it was up to rivaling Philadelphia in terms of commerce as well. Some would argue that New York was the second most city in the British Empire, behind only London. So here's another map of New York City that you see at the start. And what you can see is that where it goes up to about what is now Chambers Street, that is New York City. It's Manhattan, it's just the lower tip of Manhattan. And that is where the action happens in my book and in my research. And what I want to point out here are just a few things. So you'll see Thomas Jones's estate to the right. He is someone who features a little bit in my book. He is a member of the Delancey family and faction. And you'll see Great Square in the middle. That is part of James Delancey and the Delancey family's land holdings. They feature prominently. And that is now what is the Lower East Side. And these people feature prominently in the book because they become loyalists in the revolution. And here is a version of it where you can see sort of James Delancey, Esquire, right in the middle, right by the Bowery. He is on the cover of the book, and he's kind of at the center of my research. What is perhaps most interesting, or quite interesting in my research, is that I identified nearly 10,000 loyalists. Some prominent loyalists didn't sign any loyalist petitions or declarations that I found, including James Delancey. Delancey was not among my list of people, but he became a loyalist, and he left New York in the spring of 1775 to protest against the coercive acts and the reorientation of the British Empire in person. Now, while he was away, things obviously developed, and he never returned to New York City. And all his lands, you'll see there, Delancey Square, were confiscated from him because of his loyalism. So this is New York. This is the area that my research focuses on. It's really the tip of Manhattan. And when you're down in Manhattan today, everything feels very close together, and you can walk from one side of the city to the other down at the tip of Manhattan. It's not like it is today. Like now, if you imagine if you're at somewhere like Francis Tavern or at the Bowling Green, walking to, say, 42nd Street, where the New York Public Library is, that's around where John Moore Scott lived. It's quite a walk. To give you just another sense of what New York is now, here's a map. So this is the Ratzer map that I just showed you, placed on top of a modern or a more modern depiction of New York. And you can really just get a sense of scale here. And that's really important for my work and in my research, is a sense of scale, is that these people lived close to each other. They saw each other a lot. New York was a walking city. People used to see each other throughout the streets, going into shops, going into taverns and coffee houses. And in doing the research for this book, I actually didn't have too much correspondence between people, and that's largely because they were together. They saw each other, so they didn't have to write to each other. So to find the networks of people who became loyalists, I had to explore other sources, and I'll get into that a little bit later. And that I used these sources, things like receipts, like ledgers, like business records, church records, to link people together where correspondence could not. So we'll get moving on. We'll get into the meat of the talk. Loyalists in and from New York City. Okay, who were the loyalists? Almost since the revolution itself, New York City has been considered a hotbed of loyalism and loyalist activities. That's largely because the British Army, it was their headquarters for most of the revolution, and there were more loyalists from New York City than anywhere else. Loyalists from across the colonies flocked to the city when it was under British occupation, and that's influenced how historians from then until almost now have interpreted New York City. Joseph Tiedemann's Reluctant Revolutionaries kind of captures it well, the conservative attitude of New Yorkers toward the revolution. They were reluctant, and that's partly because historians have argued that there was a large percentage of people who were loyalists. And this, in turn, has affected how people have interpreted New York City's place within the revolution. If you think about traditional interpretations, prominent figures give a good example of this. Samuel Adams from Massachusetts, John Adams, John Dickinson, you have the people from Virginia, Patrick Henry, Jefferson, Washington. These are the people who most traditionally associate with leading the cause of revolution. It's not people from New York. It's not someone like Alexander McDougall, who I'll talk a little bit about later. It's not someone like John Jay. It's these people, because historians have argued New Yorkers were conservative, they were reluctant, they were kind of dragged toward revolution. And John Adams captured this really, really well. In writing to his former law clerk, William Tudor, he says, "What is the reason that New York is still asleep or dead in politics and war? Must it always be so? Is there anything in the air or the soil of New York unfriendly to the spirit of liberty? Are the people destitute of reason or of virtue, or what is the cause?" Adams was confused about what was happening in New York, and this is 1776. And he doesn't understand why New Yorkers aren't mobilizing behind the cause like other colonies are, like other people in other colonies are. And he's confused. Now, why is Adams confused? when he was traveling to the Continental Congress in the summer of 1774, he spent more time in New York City than anywhere else. He was there for almost a week. And when he was there, he associated with prominent people who went on to become patriots or revolutionaries. And he understood their politics, and they were similar to his own. People like Alexander McDougall, Isaac Sears, John Lamb. Writing a little bit later, he was confused about how these people were not asserting their control over the political system and how they weren't mobilizing people behind the cause. Adams was in New York for longer than anywhere else, and when he first arrived in the city, Alexander McDougall was almost there to greet him and show him around. And McDougall, I'll talk a little bit more about him later. McDougall was keen for people to see him with John Adams because they knew who Adams was. Adams was with the other delegates from Massachusetts, people like Samuel Adams. McDougall wanted to build these intercolonial connections, and that was significant. Adams was concerned about loyalism in New York as well, and he was particularly concerned about a group of people who he did not associate with when he was in New York in 1774, and that's the Delancey faction and family. Now, the Delanceys have traditionally been portrayed as Tories, as loyalists. People like James Delancey, who I mentioned earlier, his uncle Oliver Delancey, James Delancey's cousin, who was also called James Delancey in Westchester, they've been depicted as Tories. They've been either written out of history or they've been depicted in a really negative way. They were working against the cause. They were working against colonists and New Yorkers. But what is important to remember, if we go back to the middle of the 1760s, around the time when the Stamp Act was put into action, nobody was destined to become a loyalist or a revolutionary in 1765, 1766, or 1767, and on and on and on. That's one thing that I really like to stress when I'm talking about my research, is that nobody was destined to become a loyalist or a revolutionary. By that time, Adams was writing things, the lines had almost been drawn in the sand, but up until 1774, 1775, people in New York and in other colonies were working toward the same goal. They just had different methods for how they wanted to achieve that goal. They shared similar, if not the same, views on how Parliament was reorienting the British Empire. They were against it. Simply put, they were against it. The Delanceys weren't, and other loyalists were not Tories as sort of Jacobite sympathizers in that way. They were Whigs, and so were the people who went on to become patriots. Now, what's important to remember, the origins of the revolution involved people who became loyalists, and nowhere is that more evident than in New York and in New York City. Here, you have a list of Delancey's: Joseph Alacoque, Edward Nicol, Isaac Sears, John Lamb. In 1765, up until around the end of the decade, all these men were associated with the Delancey family and faction. They supported their rise to power, and they reinforced it as well. And you'll notice there, Isaac Sears and John Lamb, they go on to become prominent patriots or revolutionaries. Up until 1769, 1770, they were firmly associated with the Delanceys. Joseph Alacoque, Edward Nicol, they were Delanceyites who became loyalists in the revolution, and they were leaders among the Sons of Liberty. You'll see here, there's a screenshot of, this is taken from Wikipedia's page on the Sons of Liberty, and it lists prominent New Yorkers who were members of the Sons of Liberty. So Joseph Alacoque is listed there, so it's John Lamb, Alexander McDougall, Hercules Mulligan, Isaac Sears, Hames Solomon, Marinus Willett. It doesn't list other people who were members of the Sons of Liberty who went on to become patriots or who went on to become loyalists, but someone like Joseph Alacoque, he is a good example. He is a leader among the Sons of Liberty. He contributes to opposition to the Stamp Act and other parliamentary measures, and he goes on to become a loyalist, and a prominent loyalist at that. In 1777, he's forced to flee New York because he fears for his personal safety, and he goes to Antigua. He eventually does return, but he flees at that point because he's deemed a notorious loyalist, and he is associated firmly with the Delanceys. And this is a pattern that goes on. The Delanceys were leaders of the Sons of Liberty. James Delancey was a leader among the Sons of Liberty. There are contemporary sources, diary entries, that report on James Delancey specifically associating with them. And in doing this, they're doing it to oppose Parliament's reorientation of the British Empire. They are against the Stamp Act, they're against the Townshend duties. And by bringing these people together, they start to create associational bonds. Now, the bonds are initially based or in politics. They both don't want the Stamp Act to go in, so they come together in that. But by coming together in places and venues like taverns or in coffee houses, they reinforce these bonds and people become friends and they start to associate with one another more and more often. And people think, well, what was Delancey's view on Parliament's reorientation of the empire? What does he want to happen? Not long after the Stamp Act was due to be enforced, he writes a letter to the Marquis of Rockingham. Rockingham wasn't Prime Minister yet. He would go on to become Prime Minister the next year and repeal the Stamp Act. But he says, what say you to an American Parliament only to meddle with supplies? So that's trade. Don't startle at an American Parliament. Your colonies will exhaust you. So here, 1765, around a decade before things really kick off in New York City and across the colonies, Delancey is suggesting an American Parliament, almost a level of autonomy for the colonies that is kind of separate to what, separate to Parliament, kind of similar to what the Continental Congress was. So he's suggesting this a decade before, and it might be a little tongue-in-cheek, but he's serious in a way because he's saying, like, we're against what's happening with the Stamp Act. We want to organize our own affairs. We're happy to engage with you on trade because if we do well, you do well, and that will help us both move forward. But we want to orient our own affairs. We want to legislate for ourselves. We want to deal with our own taxation and not have taxes placed upon us. And Delancey, he was educated at Eton and at Cambridge and at the Inns of Court in London, and then he was an aide-de-camp to James Abercrombie during the French and Indian War. He was a smart guy. He'd been all over, and he had a firm understanding of the political realities of everyday life in New York City. Rockingham was one of his friends. He had a lengthy correspondence with Rockingham throughout the 1760s and 1770s, and they corresponded a lot about horse racing because they were both really interested in horses, but also they touched upon these political matters, which really relate to the orient, like how is the British Empire going to be set up? How is it going to be run? And Delancey thinks Rockingham has similar views to him, which in a way he does. Delancey also maintains a healthy correspondence with Rockingham's secretary, who's Edmund Burke. Burke eventually becomes the New York's agent in Parliament, and partly because of how the Delanceys are able to orchestrate that from afar. They share similar political views, so Delancey and his associates, his supporters, get Edmund Burke this position with the help of Rockingham to advocate and defend their interests in Parliament. Burke is meant to be their representation in Parliament. Now, I've spoken a little bit about what the Delanceys' political views were, how they opposed the reorientation of the British Empire. How did they gain support? I mentioned that people came together in taverns and in coffee houses. How did that start? It didn't just start with the Stamp Act. That was almost sort of the step one in how the Delanceys formed an association, almost all of whom who became loyalists. That really begins in 1768. And in 1768, there was an election for New York's assembly. And James Delancey had tried to get elected in 1761, a year after his father died, but he wasn't elected. In 1768, there's another election. It's been 7 years since the last one, which is the longest amount of time there can be between elections in New York. Delancey leads his family and faction slate, these people who are going up for election to the New York Assembly. And the way that they organize their campaign is unique. It's different to what's come before. Delancey and the other people who are with him who are up for election, Jacob Walton and James Jauncey, both of whom are merchants, they want to mobilize as much support as possible. And they're going to go out there. They went out there to get New Yorkers' support, to get their vote. they wanted to put their names in front of as many New Yorkers as possible. And they did this in a few ways. The first step was to take advantage of the city's print culture. And you'll see a couple of little cards here on the screen, and I'll talk more about them in a minute. But the first thing that they did is that they advertised their candidacies in the press. And they noted that in individual advertisements that didn't associate them together, that they are reluctantly standing for election to the assembly. They didn't want to be seen as opportunistic or self-interested in standing up and saying, I want to be an assemblyman. They were doing it because they felt they had to. People encouraged them to do so. So they advertised their candidacies in newspapers. Newspapers were in taverns, they were in coffee houses, people had subscriptions. This was getting their names and their candidacies in front of a lot of people. Another way that they mobilized support was commissioning essays that appeared in these newspapers outlining why they should be elected. And these essays were sometimes printed as independent broadsides. So instead of just being in a newspaper, you had just a piece of paper that had the essay on it. And they distributed things like these two cards on the screen. Now, these were about the size of playing cards. They were quite small, but they were very easy to hand around, very easy to leave on a table at a tavern, very easy to just take out the tavern, put it in your pocket, and then give to someone else next time you see them, or leave them in a store, or leave them in a marketplace. And the Delanceys filled the election campaign with things like this. And their message was one that was really effective. Now, James Delancey, although he was trained as a lawyer, he was a merchant. So are the other people on the ticket, Jacob Walton and James Chauncey. They were merchants. And their primary argument in this election is that New York City, as a mercantile commercial city, should have representatives who understand that, representatives who are merchants. It just so happened that their opponents in this election were not merchants, or they were primarily not merchants. They were lawyers. And the Delancey said that these people who are lawyers are not going to represent you well. And they're not going to drive you forward or put money in your pocket. Instead, they're going to take it out of your pocket. And you'll see in the card that's called a card that it is trade and not law supports our families. So trade, these merchants are going to support your families. The lawyers are just going to take money from them. And this was extremely effective. Not only did the Delancey sort of flood the election with these materials, they also got to say these materials, like sort of spout them back out to you in person. In the run-up to the election, which was held over a series of days, they held events in the city's taverns. Now, perhaps unsurprisingly, New York City, like it does today, had a lot of taverns. People drank a lot of alcohol. And the Delanceys held events in at least one of the city's taverns. So you'll see here, this is a receipt that a tavern keeper gave to James Delancey after the election. So you'll see the dates there in March 1768. And the dates go Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. And this is a sort of an itinerary, a receipt of everything that was sold at Stout's Tavern. And it's a lot of alcohol. So you'll see Tenerife wine, Madeira, double bowls of punch, drams, cider, beer, food. A lot of drink, it's a lot of alcohol, and it's a lot of food. The Delanceys encouraged people to come to these events. They paid for everything. This is one receipt to James Delancey. James Delancey paid for everything. So these events where white male voters could come, they would sit beside each other on those long tables that you see at Francis Tavern, similar ones to those, and they came together in that way. Talk about how it was merchants and not lawyers who were going to drive the colony forward. In the end, the Delancey candidates were elected in this election. And if I go back a screen, you'll see a quote there from Charles Ingalls, who was assistant rector of Trinity Church, eventually becomes rector, and a prominent loyalist. Writing about the Delanceys' opponent in this election, he says, they were outwrote as well as outvoted. And what he means by saying they were outwrote is that not just that the Delanceys published more materials than their opponents, it's that their opponents didn't really publish anything. They relied on traditional means to mobilize voters, which was deference, things written on scraps of paper. They didn't encourage people to vote for them. In a way, they expected people to vote for them. But at this time in 1768, the Delanceys are immensely popular in New York City. These people go on to become loyalists. What's particularly interesting is that a majority of the Delancey voters in 1768 become loyalists, 1775, 1776. And this is the start of an association, really, that the Delancey start to create, and they reinforce it over the coming years. The Stamp Act is a traditional starting point for the American Revolution. It gives that nice 10-year period for when you can go from Britons to Americans, or from colonists to revolutionaries. In New York City, the divide between those who become patriots and those who become loyalists really begins in 1768, and it starts with the New York General Assembly election. But that's not the only election. A year later, in 1769, there's another election, and it's the same. The Delancey candidates who go up for election, they add on John Kruger, who's a prominent Dutch New Yorker who was near in the 1750s. They add him onto their ticket, and they go up against Philip Livingston, Peter Vanbrugh Livingston, John Warren Scott, and Theo Van Wyck. You'll see here, just from the graphic, that you'll see that the Livingstons started to put out campaign materials. Now, this one is at the Library of Congress. It's similar to the cards that I showed earlier, perhaps a little bigger. This is to just get their candidacies out there. The Delanceys did the same thing. They announced their candidacies. They started to mobilize support in the same ways that they did the year before. And the Livingstons, they go about a different route. They insert, or they inject, religion into this election. And William Livingston, who's not up for election, in sort of collaboration or cooperation with John Warren Scott and others, they write a series of essays that are published in the press to mobilize support to them and really try and take support away from the Delanceys. And they argue that the Delanceys are all Anglicans, many of them were, and they wanted to establish, get an American bishop in the colonies, and this bishop was going to take away their religious liberties. The Delanceys kind of flipped this argument on its head and said the Livingston candidates, William Livingston and John Warren Scott, they're trying to divide us. We want to bring people together and move them forward. And in sort of preaching this message of unity, the Delanceys gained more support in 1769 than they had gained the year before. And all of their candidates are elected, and no Livingston candidates are elected. The year before, Philip Livingston, who appears here kind of at the top of the ticket, he was elected in 1768, and he was the Assembly Speaker. In 1769, he was meant to be running kind of independently. The Delancey tried to recruit him to sort of their campaign, but he didn't want to have anything to do with that. But then, as you'll see here, his name starts being associated with others. So the Delancey's kind of, they hold their hands and say they don't really want anything to do with Livingston. And some people criticize him for this association with other members of his family, and they think he's a snake in the grass. Is one of the quotes from the time, is that he was playing a double game. He was only out for himself. And the Delanceys used this. They used this to mobilize support. And what's interesting is that the people who appear here, the Livingston and Scott, they become revolutionaries or patriots in the revolution. And it's the Delanceys who are saying they are self-interested. They are opportunistic. If you go back a little bit to what I was saying earlier, people have depicted the Delanceys as self-interested and as opportunistic. And they're saying at this time in 1769 that the Livingstons are, the people who become patriots are. So after the Delanceys are elected, they're kind of at the top of the height of their popularity in New York City. But they have to legislate. They're now being elected to the Assembly. They have to represent the interests of their constituents, of their voters, and do what they said they're going to do, which is put more money in their pocket, protect the public good, protect the public welfare, move everything forward in New York so it can really establish itself as the most successful colony, the most successful city in the colonies. One of the things that's problematic in sort of late 1769 is that they have to deal with British soldiers. And New York City is the headquarters of the British Army in North America. They have to find a place to put them. New York City is also in a bit of an economic downturn, which was another reason why people voted for the Delanceys. And the Delanceys, they collaborate and they speak with Isaac Sears, who's still with them at this time, about how that they can sort of inject money into the city's economy, but also deal with these British soldiers. So this is to do with the Quartering Act. And if you want to read a really good book about the Quartering Act, I'd recommend John McCurdy's book and the reviews that have been put out about it, and that will help give a better understanding of the Quartering Act. Because more time than I have, I don't have enough time to go into that fully tonight. But Sears says that if you tie on, he says this to Delancey, John Kruger, and James Delancey, if you tie on the sort of the injection of paper money into the economy, people won't mind if you sort of fund for British troops to stay in New York. Now, this is a big misstep, and it's a misstep for two reasons. One, the Delanceys and Sears didn't really have a good sense of the city about the attitudes toward British soldiers. And two, recently the Delanceys had wanted to bring sort of popular politics to the people, and they'd arranged for the construction of a viewing assembly in the New York Assembly, so people would come in and watch their elected officials do what they do. Walk in and watch them advance and protect their interests. On this day, in December, when the Quartering Act was discussed, the doors were locked and nobody was allowed inside. People did not like this. The Delanceys had told them that they were going to advance and protect their interests, and you could see them doing this. This was, for some, an instance of them not doing it. They argued that they were forming an alliance with the Lieutenant Governor at the time, Cadwallader Colden, who was probably the most hated colonial official in British North America, with maybe the exception of Francis Bernard and Thomas Hutchinson, and certainly the most hated in New York. And this simple act, closing the doors, passing the legislation, causes people to mobilize in opposition to the Delanceys. And the opposition is led by Alexander McDougall. McDougall and his family emigrated from Scotland in the late 1730s. He was the son of a milkman. He established himself as a merchant, a privateer. Historians have said that he is a member of the Sons of Liberty in 1765. I found no evidence of that, and other historians have not found evidence of that. He certainly is later, but this moment in 1769, not in 1765, is when he really comes onto the scene. And he mobilizes opposition against the Delanceys by writing an anonymous broadside called To the Betrayed Inhabitants of New York. And he really argues here that the Delanceys have betrayed New Yorkers. They were going to advance and protect their interests. Here they are, McDougall argued, just looking out for themselves. McDougall is eventually, people identify him as the author and they imprison him. He continues to mobilize support that way. And when he really comes onto the scene, people flock to him. They see him as the John Wilkes of America. He kind of appropriates the number 45 from the 45th issue of the North Briton, and he becomes a very popular figure in the city and out of it. And when people start to kind of come to him, to flock to him, the people who do that, they almost to a person become patriots or revolutionaries during the revolution. So if you go back to what I was saying about the elections in 1768, those people, the people who voted for the Delanceys, mostly became loyalists. By this time in late 1769, early 1770, when McDougall is imprisoned, they're still with the Delanceys, and they still become loyalists in the revolution. McDougall's supporters become patriots in the revolution. And it's because of this that I think McDougall is probably one of the most underappreciated and understudied figures in early American history. He goes on to serve in the Revolutionary War, as I'm sure many of you know, becomes a major general, but there's not really been that much written about him. So although my book focuses on those who became loyalists, it's also gives a thorough analysis of Alexander McDougall's ascent in New York City politics. The way that he mobilizes support, aside from being viewed as a martyr for New Yorkers' liberties, is that he publishes a lot of stuff in the press, just in the way that the Delanceys did in 1768 and 1769. And he argues that he is the one that is going to advance and protect New Yorkers' interests and the people who are with him. He doesn't kind of just put himself at the top of the pyramid. He views himself as one of the people. And that's how he starts to mobilize support. And he publishes a number of essays and from 1770 up until the Revolution. Some of them remain excellent, his drafts, and one in particular is very interesting. It was published closer to 1774, 75, and published in the press. It was also published separately as a broadside. And a few years ago, a number of years ago now, I was a postdoctoral fellow at the New York Historical Society, and that's where McDougall's papers are, so the papers of Alexander McDougall. And unlike, say, the papers of George Washington, the papers of Jefferson, or other prominent figures at this time, he only has two boxes or two microfilm reels of his papers. That's partly why I think he's understudied, is there's just not that much material. And I remember going through it, and I wanted to find a draft of one of his essays, and I thought it was there. I was pretty sure that it was there, and it wasn't in either of these two boxes. And I was frustrated because I was looking for a list of names, because in the newspaper when it was published, it said something to the effect of it was signed by a great number of people. And I wanted to see if these great number of people listed their names on the draft. So I spoke to one of the archivists there, and he just went back sort of into the shelves to try and find this document. And I wasn't sure where he was going to look, because I had these two boxes and I thought that was it. But he came out with the oversized box, and in that was a draft of this essay. And it was very large. It was on vellum paper, and it wasn't in the best of condition, but you could see clearly lists of names. Every single name became revolutionary or a patriot in the Revolution. So the Delancey had their voters. There are other documents around the time that have a list of Delancey names. They become loyalists in the Revolution. The McDougall supporters become patriots in the Revolution. But what I think it is important to remember here about McDougall's ascent is that when the Delanceys were talking about the Quartering Act and British troops, they spoke to Isaac Sears, and Sears said there'd be no issue if paper money was issued into the economy. So if they looked after people's sort of pocketbooks by putting money into the economy so they could spend it, that everything would be okay, that they wouldn't mind what had happened with the British troops, but they were wrong. What's also especially interesting is at this time is when Isaac Sears and John Lamb break from the Delanceys and join McDougall. So Sears could have been calculated here. He might have already spoken to McDougall and determined he was going to go with them, but at this time he breaks with them, and he stays with McDougall all the way through the start of the Revolution. Also significant is that one of New York's printers breaks with the Delanceys, John Holt. So New York City, up until 1770, has three newspapers. One's published by James Parker, one's published by Hugh Gain, and one is published by John Holt. The Delanceys, prior to this, had flooded their materials in all three. That's a lot of newspaper. From 1769, Holt breaks with the Delanceys and supports McDougall. So McDougall's essays appear in John Holt's newspaper. And out of the three, I would say that John Holt's is probably the most popular. James Rivington starts publishing his newspaper later, 1774. But prior to that, the Delanceys in the end up having only Hugh Gain's newspaper and James Parker's. And James Parker dies in 1770 as well, so that's a newspaper that's pretty much out of the game from then. And John Holt associates with McDougall and really becomes one of the most prominent revolutionary or patriot printers around. John Holt is another figure who appears a lot in my work, and I also think that he is underappreciated and understudied. And it's because of this, and what happens in 1769, that the Delanceys get a bad rap. And if you have a look through some contemporary sources at the time, William Smith Jr.'s diary, his historical memoirs, he lays into the Delanceys, saying that they had sort of turned their backs on New Yorkers, they were only out to advance their interests, and historians have really relied on this source to depict the Delanceys as self-interested, as opportunistic. They only wanted to advance their own interests, they wanted to partner with Colden, who everybody hated, and they didn't best represent New Yorkers' interests at all. What I argue it might be good. Although they really misstepped over the Quartering Act and the funding of and British soldiers, is that there was repeated evidence of them advancing the public good, advancing and protecting the public good, and looking out for New Yorkers' interests. I mentioned the viewing gallery, the viewing chamber beforehand. There were other instances as well. So between sort of 1768, 1769, during the sort of that just under 2 year period, the Delancey just showed themselves to be progressive. They were Republicans, lowercase r. They were popular. I mentioned in 1769 that their popularity was higher than it's ever been before. That's because they had shown in the year prior that they were advancing New Yorkers' interests. And that one of the ways that they did this is they really lent into them being merchants. So in 1768, they established the Chamber of Commerce, which is still around today. Most of the early members of the Chamber of Commerce were Delanceys, and most went on to become loyalists in the Revolution. So on the screen now, this is the seal of the Chamber of Commerce, and this is at the New York State Museum in Albany. So you'll see the Roman god Mercury here, the Catechus. You see the cornucopia symbolizing plenty. There's a ship in the background looking toward a new dawn. It's a new era, a new age for New York. The Chamber of Commerce is still around today. Its early officers, all Delanceys, all became loyalists in the Revolution. Chamber of Commerce wasn't the only sort of association that they formed. They also formed the Marine Society. So here is the Marine Society seal as well. Now this one was a little harder to find. They didn't have something like this nice sort of painting of it at the New York State Museum. I had to pull the Marine Society, which is still around today. I had to pull this off a menu for a Marine Society dinner or gala that was online at the New York Public Library. But the Marine Society was set up to protect and give money to widows for people who had died at sea. So this is similar in its goal to the Chamber of Commerce, similar in its focus, thinking about New York City's commercial interests, how its commerce is really going to drive people forward. And that's something that James Delancey touches on again and again in his correspondence with Rockingham. Now you think of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness as being something that's part of American ideals. James Delancey, prior to that, I said life, liberty, and trade. Life, liberty, and commerce was what New York was advancing. And that really captures the Delancey mindset. Life, liberty, and commerce. They were all intertwined. So after Alexander McDougall kind of rises and comes on the scene, we have a real division in New York between those who become loyalists and those who become revolutionaries or patriots. So on the one side, you have people like James Delancey, Jacob Walton, who's an assemblyman, James Jauncey, also an assemblyman. You have George Brewerton, senior and junior, father and son. Senior is on the Common Council, alderman. And then you have families like the Rhinelander family, or the Late family, or the Nicol family. And the Rhinelanders, the Lates, and the Nichols don't often appear in traditional histories of New York, and I try to really focus in on them and their political behavior prior to and during the Revolution. Someone who appears very prominently in my book is Frederick Rhinelander. Now, Frederick Rhinelander signed every loyalist document from Manhattan that I was able to find. He signed 2 loyalist declarations or petitions that were left on taverns. So he came in and signed his name, and he also took the oath of allegiance when it was offered in 1777. So finding Rhinelander, his brother also signed, and other members of his family. Went to the New York Historical Society where the Rhinelander papers are, because I knew that the Rhinelander family were still around after the Revolution, so I was interested. And found out that Rhinelander had started to associate with the Delanceys in the late 1760s, reinforced those bonds in the early 1770s, and he stayed with them all the way through to the start of the Revolution. Now, Rhinelander actually becomes what might be considered a notorious loyalist. When the Americans take control of New York, some people do leave, and among those people is Frederick Rhinelander, and he travels across the river to New Jersey. And he appears, if you go on to Finders Online, where the federated collection for the papers of George Washington or the papers of Thomas Jefferson, and type in Rhinelander, he appears. And he appears in the papers of George Washington. And he's in the English neighborhood, with other, which is in Bergen County. And he appears with another Delancey out there. And they're kind of identified by George Washington as prominent loyalists. On the other hand, people who become revolutionaries, I've spoken about some of these people already. You have MacDougall, Sears, John Holt the printer, Hugh Hughes, Gershom Mott, John Moran Scott, and some of the Livingstons. If we go back to 1768 and 1769, Scott, who is a lawyer and a Yale graduate, he is the target of a lot of the Delancey attacks. They kind of use him as their archetype, their stereotypical lawyer who's just out there to try and steal your money. He's a very gifted orator, and he's able to mobilize support to MacDougall, mobilize support to their cause, and in opposition to the Delanceys. But how were these people different? I mentioned earlier that the people who became loyalists were not Tories, as we traditionally understand that they were Whigs. How were they different? How did they fall on different sides of the ideological spectrum? The Delanceys, kind of moderate establishment Whigs. They're sort of equivalents in Britain with the Marquis of Rockingham, who I mentioned earlier, and Edmund Burke. The way that their politics was based was all about commercial interests, economic growth. That's how they thought that they would move New York City forward. On the other hand, you have MacDougall. They were radical Whigs. Their equivalents are someone like John Wilkes, who MacDougall was very closely associated with, Isaac Barry, and William Pitt the Elder. Their sort of politics was all based on the constant monitoring of government to make sure that government was protecting, advancing New Yorkers' needs. And in 1769, they thought that the Delanceys were not doing that. And that's how they kind of rose up in opposition to them. It was political liberties that they always wanted to check. Now, one historian has said that competing sort of ideologies governed the British Empire. In New York City, it was competing interpretations of New York's and New York City's place within the British Empire. So they had competing interpretations of their place within the empire and how to move the city forward. Going back to Frederick Rhinelander, I mentioned that he was a Delanceyite and he had joined them much earlier and he stayed with them. I also mentioned that the Delanceys were against Parliament's reorientation of the British Empire, and here's Frederick Rhinelander sort of summarising the Delanceys' views. He says, "The right of Parliament to tax this country, I need not tell you, we all disapprove of. By the arbitrary and unjust resolves of the Congress," and that's the Continental Congress, "I must tell you that we, the Protestants, detest." They're against the Continental Congress. I started this talk talking about Frederick Phillips and the New York Assembly. Rhinelander and his associates in the Delancey family and faction, they want opposition to come from the Assembly, not to come from the Continental Congress or come from other committees or other congresses. Rhinelander says some more. "We have a small political club selected from the old Amicable Society." Now, this is significant because prior to 1775, Delanceyites had formed a small political club, and it was called the Old Amicable Society. And there's a list of members at the New York Public Library. Almost all of them Delanceys, almost all of them become loyalists in the Revolution. And you'll see our highest wish is a speedy reconciliation, and if this province fights, it will be for the king. We must enlarge the club and meet frequent during the assembly sessions, so that we may be the better enabled to counteract the Blues. Now, the Blues are MacDougall and his supporters. So these people had come together in support of the Delanceys based on politics. They'd formed a political club to talk about their politics that brought them closer together. And in 1775, Rhinelander and other Delanceys thought if New York fights, it will be for the king. They thought that MacDougall and his supporters, who they kind of denigrate as the Blues, and criticize them as largely Presbyterian, they thought that they would be able to counteract, to overcome them. And Rhinelander wasn't alone in saying things like this. William Late, I mentioned the Late family earlier, he summarizes here the Delancey views. "I cannot, with some, allow the Parliament every power, For it does not to me seem reasonable that the internal regulation of this country, and both with respect to taxation and police, should be within their jurisdiction. So this relates back to what James Delancey had said many years earlier to Rockingham about what was Parliament's role in New York. What would New Yorkers or New York's Assembly have control over? Late thought and the Delanceys thought that taxation and police should be within their jurisdiction. They should control that. And William Late, who goes on to become a loyalist, is against Parliament's reorientation of the British Empire. He's against some of the legislation that has gone into place, the Coercive Acts, for example. And he says some more. Our Assembly, keep talking about the Assembly, our Assembly, thank heaven, has pretty nearly pursued what you recommended, and that's opposition to the Coercive Acts through petitions and other documents like that. They have not adopted the proceedings of Congress, but have proceeded on their own bottom. And this is crucial here. So after the First Continental Congress, people who go on to become revolutionaries or patriots, they think it's a great success. They have the Continental Association that people have to sign. You're either with us or you're against us. The proceedings of Congress are adopted across the colonies. New York's Assembly does not adopt it. They do not agree or consent or put forward a slate of delegates for the Second Continental Congress in 1775. Instead, they're going to take it upon themselves to protest the Coercive Acts. They're going to do it what they think is the legal way because they have been legally elected. This is partly why James Delancey travels to Britain to protest the Coercive Acts. So they really think that the Continental Congress and the committees that are formed to eventually elect delegates to that are not legal. People who were in the New York Assembly were. A good way, another way to show the divide between New Yorkers is through the city's newspapers. I mentioned John Holt's New York Journal and Rivington's Gazette as well. You'll see here the mastheads are what I want to draw your attention to here. You have two newspapers here, two different visions of and for New York City. So look at the dates on both in 1774, one's in November and one's in June. The bottom one, we'll start with John Holt. Holt goes through a few iterations of what's going to appear on his masthead. Now he starts off with the British Royal Coat of Arms. He eventually goes to nothing, just the name of the newspaper, and settles on Benjamin Franklin's Unite or Die image of the snake. Now, Isaiah Thomas in Massachusetts also uses the snake later on, but Holt did it first. And I think it really captures McDougall and Holt's interpretation of how they should move forward here. They have to unite or it won't get done. On the top, Rivington has the British Royal Coat of Arms. Previously, he had his masthead was centered on commerce. It had vessels sailing off into the horizon, kind of like the Chamber of Commerce. But he is now settling on the British Royal Coat of Arms. So you can really see two different visions of New York here. One is about colonial cooperation, or intercooperation. One is about the British Empire. One, John Holt, eventually becomes sort of a revolutionary or a patriot newspaper, and Rivington's his newspaper newspaper printing business kind of gets destroyed by Isaac Sears and people who support Holt. What's very interesting is the dates here. So one is before the Continental Congress and one is after it. And this is significant in showing how the divisions took place, how people who became revolutionaries or patriots really did move first. They were able to mobilize support first. And people who became loyalists were a little bit slower. And their reliance on, or at least James Rivington's reliance on the British Royal Coat of Arms might not have mobilized as many people as he had hoped. So here we have kind of a summary of what I've been saying about the Delancey's attitudes toward protesting or opposing Parliament's reorientation of the British Empire. Use elected representatives. That's probably step one. They want people like James Delancey, Jacob Alton, James Jauncey to advance and protect their interests through petitions. They had voted for them. They should be the ones to do it. They didn't want any committees, they didn't want any conventions, and they didn't want any congresses. That's what they wanted to do. They wanted to use the New York Assembly, not the Continental Congress, or one of the many committees that forms in New York City at this time. Sort of the Committee of 50, the Committee of 51, Committee of 60, and the Committee of 100. They don't want them to advance their interests. They don't want to use violence or inhibit freedom of the press. These are both things that people who went on to become patriots and revolutionaries did. And they want to use New York's agent, which is Edmund Burke, in Parliament to advance their interests. And when Delancey goes, he wants to work with people like Burke. He wants to work with people like Rockingham to do this, and other friends of America, as they were called. But in the end, the Delanceys and people who became loyalists truly believed that New York City was better off in the British Empire. In the end, people who became patriots believed that they were not. And this really relates to the formation of a new identity that people like Alexander McDougall started to do, but people like James Delancey did not. James Delancey could not cooperate with other colonies in the same way that Alexander McDougall did. In the summer and the spring of 1774 is when McDougall really starts to cultivate a relationship with other colonists, and he's writing to people like Samuel Adams in Massachusetts. And in a letter that he co-authors or co-writes with Isaac Sears, they're the ones who suggest a Continental Congress. And it's in the Samuel Adams papers online at the New York Public Library, they suggest this Continental Congress as a way to protest. In 1770, when McDougall is imprisoned, James Otis in Massachusetts is slated to possibly be his lawyer to protect his interests. When he can't do it, John Dickinson in Pennsylvania is slated to possibly be his lawyer, and that doesn't work out. Neither of those work out. But early on, McDougall is ready to turn to people who share similar views to him in other colonies. Delancey doesn't do that. He turns to people like Rockingham and turns to people like Edmund Burke. But what's really interesting here is that when you look around New York today, there are still instances of loyalists and loyalism's impact on the city. I mentioned briefly that Frederick Rhinelander stayed after the Revolution. He eventually goes on to become a very prominent citizen, from a very prominent family that eventually associate with the Astor family in New York. And when he dies in the early 1800s, his obituaries or death notices that are published in New York's press, which is bigger then than it was in the 1770s, there's no mention of what happened during the Revolution. No mention that he was isolated or identified by Washington as a prominent loyalist. Nothing mentioned about the Oath of Allegiance or the Loyalist Declarations, petitions that he signed. There's none of that. The Late family also stay. They also go on to become quite prominent. And they're not the only one. Cadwallader Colden's descendants, one of his descendants eventually becomes mayor. Another Delancey, John Watts, one of his descendants, also goes on to serve public office for New York. Alexander McDougall and others eventually contribute to this, sort of the reintegration of loyalists in New York. And there's good work by Brett Palfreyman and Rebecca Brannon on the reintegration of loyalists. But they leave their stamp. The Chamber of Commerce, as I mentioned, is still around today. Francis Tavern was initially owned by the Delancey family. That's still around. And then if you go around the Lower East Side, there's Delancey Street. Why is it called Delancey Street? That's because it's around where Delancey lands were. So what I want to say is that loyalist New York is New York. Revolutionary or patriot New York is New York as well. And that people who became loyalists in the Revolution shouldn't be denigrated or attacked as opportunistic or self-interested. Instead, I would encourage people to explore sort of the why and the how of how they became loyalists, rather than just looking at the end point. You could start at the end point as I did and go backward, and then explore sort of their motivations of why they became loyalists. And I think people will find that loyalist stories may be similar to the Delanceys, or they may be completely different, but people's paths to 1775 or 1776 is not linear. People who became patriots, they didn't have that predestined a decade earlier, just as people who became loyalists did not have that predestined earlier. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, you so much, Chris. That was great. I definitely was taking some notes during your presentation. I think we're going to feature the Chamber of Commerce. We do like on this day in history on our social media. So that was a really fun fact that I did not know. Folks who are still with us, if you have any questions, you can go ahead and drop them in the chat. I was going to ask about Delancey Street and why that street did not get renamed like so many other streets in New York did. So do you have any theories as to why that one survives and so many other loyalist connections are kind of erased post-revolution?
That's a good question. I lived in New York for a long time, but I didn't actually go to Delancey Street until sort of late in the time that I lived there. And I think it might be because a number of people who supported the Delanceys still stayed around and they still stayed in power. And they didn't want to sort of rename streets in the way that they did with others. And it's interesting because most people don't know why it's named Delancey Street. They can't even name anyone from the Delancey family, but they used to own almost all of the Lower East Side, and it was all confiscated. But some of the people who bought the land were the original tenants, like they had lived there, and that could have contributed to over the years. Because I'm not sure, like most if not all of the Delanceys left. James Delancey left in May '75. He never came back. His uncle Oliver goes on to lead a loyalist provincial regiment, and Delancey's cousin James, he kind of roams about Westchester doing raids, and his people don't like what he's doing. So it is a little bit surprising that they didn't rename it. I would only have other theories. If you have any theories, I'd love to hear them.
Yeah, well, the Phillipses also, of course, eventually leave thanks to the Act of Attainder. They also get their properties confiscated. And Beverly Robinson and his son, Beverly Robinson Jr., are also leading Loyal American regiments, much like the Delancey's militias. And they leave for England. Some of the Robinsons end up in Canada. But I'm for sure, I think a lot of Phillips' tenants were loyalists. A number of them joined the Loyal American Militia. So I'd be curious to see how many of them stayed as well.
So. I know there's one person who lived on Phillips Manor whose name I always remember. It's called Gilbert Pugsley. Just his surname, I just always remember Pugsley.
Yeah, there's also William Pugsley, the Pugsley family.
And I think they went to Canada.
Okay.
So I did some research on trying to find out where some of sort of the people I identified went, and because I found some ships lists in the National Archives in just outside London, and I tried to place them, but it was going to be like when you're doing graduate work, doctoral work in the UK, you have a time limit. You can't go for on and on and on like you can sometimes here. So I only had 4 years, so I was like, there's no way I'm going to be able to do this in 4 years. I was like, that'll be the next project. It's like I'll try and pick up the story and see where they went and explore it a bit further. But it's something that's always interested me. It's like, where did they go and how did they get on? And a comparative analysis of those who stayed and those who left. Like, how did they get on? A comparative biography of those would be really interesting.
All right, we've got a couple questions in the chat here. So Robert wants to know, this is the big question, how much of a role did religion play in the division, e.g. Whigs versus Loyalists?
I think it played a big role. I don't think it was sort of the central reason, but it was one of the most significant reasons for people dividing into loyalists and patriots. So this is in the appendix of my book. I go into a prosopographical or collective biography of the people who became loyalists, and I found out that a vast majority of them were Anglicans, and there were some Presbyterians there, but there weren't many. A vast majority were Anglicans, and this is partly because Trinity Church has digitized a lot of records, which I'm very grateful for. So I had a lot of sources for them. But if you go to the sources, they're talking sort of even correspondence, or less so essays, because they're more they're not as reliable. But some correspondence talks about how this is a religious war. It's being led by Presbyterians. Of course, this ignores the people who are Anglican, who are patriots as well. But in New York, at least, it was an important factor.
Yeah, we had a speaker in January, Dr. Kieran O'Keefe, who actually, he's done with his dissertation now, also on Loyalists, but he wrote his master's thesis specifically on Loyalists in Newburgh.
Mm-hmm.
And it was basically about the religious divisions. He did a super in-depth dive into loyalism and patriots in Newburgh and kind of the religious divisions. And it's available online if Robert, if you want to check it out, I can shoot you the link.
Kieran sent me some material on Frederick Phillips that appears at the end of my book about when he was leaving and how emotional he apparently was. And that's in the MacDonald papers at Westchester County Historical Society. And I was very pleased to learn recently that they're going to be digitized, funded by the NEH, the National Endowment for the Humanities. And because I've used them sparingly, I've had a few scans of here and there, and the Phillips stuff that Kieran sent me was great, and I made sure to credit him and thank him for sending it.
Great, yeah.
Grateful for collaboration.
It's we're learning more about the American Revolution in terms of Phillips Manor, and the staff here are trying to do more research in the lead up to the 250th, right? And so we're the Loyalist site for New York, so we're trying to get super up to speed on Loyalist stuff. But I'm astonished at, the Patriot side, everybody's papers are digitized. Mm-hmm. And the British and the Loyalist side, nobody's stuff is digitized, or very little of it is digitized. So even Sir Henry Clinton, he's a big figure in the American Revolution. His stuff's not digitized. So I'm very happy to hear that. So thank you for sharing.
I was really pleased that the Clements Library, where the Clinton papers are, and the papers of Thomas Gage are there, and the Gage papers are being digitized. I hope they tag on the Clinton papers after.
Yeah, we should maybe start a little letter writing campaign.
Yeah, and because it's very difficult to find materials on the British perspectives on the Revolution. There is a very large multi-volume collection called Documents of the American Revolution, edited by Kevin Davies, that you can get on archive.org, but they're very hard to find anywhere else.
Yeah. Great. Well, we're also, I'm also interested in the stuff that's generally not published. I don't really care about the military troop movements. I want to know, stuff about the Black pioneers and who is in charge of what and when are things happening, right? Anyway, Kelly asks, says, what are your favorite recommendations for learning more about the complexity of the journey toward becoming a loyalist or patriot?
I'm going to have to, I'll plug my book here, for Once Urban Centers Journey, because although the primary focus for those who became loyalists, it explores the origins of the revolution for those who became patriots as well. So that's One Urban Center. If you want to look at people in Massachusetts, Colin Nicholson has written a book on Francis Bernard that focuses on kind of the loyalist perspective to revolution. And I'd also, let me have a look at my shelf here, because I have a few here. Roger Champagne's biography of Alexander McDougall. It's old. It was published for the bicentennial in 1976. That offers a very good account of McDougall, of just McDougall. And it's kind of triumphant for McDougall and kind of portrays him as kind of the saving light for New Yorkers. One thing that I would like to see in future scholarship is more complex interaction for those who became loyalists in the revolution, because almost every textbook, every history starts in 1765 and it begins the journey toward revolution, and it focuses on similar people who we all know, and ignores those who became loyalists who participated. So I would like to see more studies about that in places like Philadelphia, places like Boston, or in Rhode Island, just to see that, because I think that would be very interesting. Yeah, and my book is also on Audible as well.
I'm just going to put a plug for the Phillips Manor Hall bookshop.
And the Phillips Manor bookshop.
Which we have several books on Loyalists, some more general books, and some newer, more specific ones on New York. I'm looking at, we have Unnatural Rebellion, we have Liberty's Exiles, we have one called Tories, and then of course we also have Chris's book, Unfriendly to Liberty. So if you're in the area and want to stop by, you're welcome to visit our gift shop, or we do also have a bibliography on our website, phillipsmanorhall.com, that lists, we have a section specifically about loyalists. All right, Robert asks, were there two James Delanceys, the one who you discussed today, and the loyalist who headed a loyalist unit in Westchester?
Yeah, that's right. There's, I kind of think the James Delancey North and James Delancey South is how I think of them. And some people know James Delancey North, who headed the Westchester unit, the Loyalist Westchester unit, and he appears kind of frequently in the papers of George Washington because they say he's up to no good conducting raids and making things very difficult. Then there's James Delancey South, who's based in Manhattan and eventually goes to England, wants to come back, never does. One is in the military in the Revolution and one is not.
Yeah, the Phillipses are also very confusing because there's 4 Fredericks and then 2 Phillips and a bunch of, yeah, it's a little confusing. All those wealthy families like to recycle their same names over and over again, which I'm sure frustrates historians and genealogists to no end.
Yeah.
Alex says, you mentioned that MacDougall was originally from Scotland. Were the Delanceys originally from England? And did people with Dutch ancestry tend to skew towards one side or the other?
Yeah, so MacDougall was from the Outer Hebrides in Scotland. So he was from a small island called Islay, and he moved to New York in 1738. The Delanceys were originally from France. They were Huguenots, and after the Edict of Nantes was revoked in the late 17th century, they came to New York. So the first Delancey to move to New York was called Etienne when he moved, and he eventually anglicized his name to Stephen, and that was a pattern for the Delancey. So they were French Huguenots, and then they became Anglicans, and so they really, this might have, you could argue that this helped lead their path toward loyalism, is that New York was their newfound home, and that's why they wanted to stay. People with Dutch ancestry are really interesting. The Dutch people who I worked on who lived in Brooklyn, I found that they switched sides a lot. So when the Americans were in control, they were happy to support the Americans, build American defenses. But when the British retook control or took control in 1776, they were very happy to take them apart and then sort of work with the British. And that's a sort of a common feature, is that people who were not, I don't want to say flip-flopping, they were supporting whoever was there because they just wanted to get on with their lives. For some of the Dutch people who lived in New York, I've seen it on both sides. Some people have gone toward revolutionaries or patriots, and some have gone toward loyalists. It all depends from my angle on who they associated with and when. But those in Brooklyn, I found that they were switching sides. And during one of my sort of first ever research trips to New York, well over a decade now, I stayed in Brooklyn. I was lucky enough to have a friend who was living there. He had the postdoctoral fellowship at New York Historical that I eventually got. He was also from Scotland, and I stayed with him, and we commuted into the city to New York Historical or another archive, and I was noticing all the subway stops had Dutch names of people who were in my database, and I was like, people from that family signed loyalist declarations like Lefferts. I was like, I have many Lefferts in my database. That's quite interesting. So when I would go to what is now the Center for Brooklyn History, go into the Lefferts papers, then there's not really much there about their loyalism, but it was interesting to understand sort of what was going on where they lived at that time. So many of them they wanted to sort of maintain their way of life. There would be patriots or revolutionaries when they were there, loyalists when the British were there, and many of them took the oath of allegiance. And there is a copy, or there is an oath of allegiance from Brooklyn at the Clements Library in the papers of Henry Clinton, and it's split up by what was then all of the towns. Now it's just the regions of Brooklyn. So you'll see like Bushwick, and it'll have the name, and that's how I was starting to point out the subway stops. Was from that original oath of allegiance.
Yeah, talking about anglicizing the Phillipses, when Frederick Phillips I emigrates to New Netherland, right, back in the 1650s, I think, he's Friedrich Philipson.
Yeah.
And they anglicized to Frederick Phillips, right? And so they are ethnically Dutch, but over the course of the decades, they anglicize. So I have a related follow-up question, which is, have you run across anything in your research about why so many of the big manor lords, besides Phillips, sided with the Patriots, like the Livingstons and the Van Rensselaers and the Van Cortlands and all those folks?
Oh, the short answer is no, I haven't. I could sort of rhapsodize about it, and it's like especially about the Livingstons, because their holdings were kind of diversified, and they had many people in the city as well, and that might have contributed to it. And then the Van Cortlands end up fighting. Some of them end up fighting in the revolution, and it's part of me thinks it's because they wanted to break the stranglehold of certain areas or just kind of advance their interests. But it's something that I know Sung Bok Kim has written it's an old book now, but it's a very good book about this. But I think the manorial estates is something that's definitely ripe for future research, especially the people who lived on those estates. But finding their records are going to be hard. So you're going to have to try and piece them together and maybe find out if they enlisted in the Continental Army or a state regiment or militia. But I think doing that might give us a better sense of what it was like to live in those places and what it was like to live under the manorial lords. Like, what were they like? Did their tenants influence their behavior? Because that's something that I would quite like to know myself personally.
Yeah, we haven't confirmed it with a ton of research, but the story usually goes that a lot of the Phillips tenants were loyalists.
Yeah.
Because of Frederick Phillips was loyalist. But the Livingstons in particular in the 1860s, and also some of the Phillipses, had a bunch of tenant farmer uprisings, right? They were not happy with that. So I think that might have also influenced, like, were you happy with your landlord, or were you not happy with your landlord? Was maybe influencing what you'd go the opposite side of, or the same side as your landlord. But I'm just curious because, you know, a lot of people talk about the American Revolution being kind of like a civil war, right? And I ran across a letter a couple weeks ago from John Jay to Susanna Phillips Robinson. And it's basically threatening her and her family if Beverly Robinson doesn't come back and you know, sign a whatever, the oath of loyalty to the new Patriot government. And he ends up, you know, going to New York City and then starting the Loyal American Regiment. But they're cousins, you know, like they share a great grandfather. So, and the Jay family was very friendly with the Frederick Phillips family, Frederick III. So, you know, it was very shocking document to me to read this kind of like, you know, it's very couched in terms of, oh, well, I'm concerned for your safety, but you and your kids might get attacked if your husband doesn't come back and do this.
Yeah.
It's coming from her cousin. So, yeah, interesting interesting stuff out there. All right, we have a couple more questions. People keep asking more questions, which is great. Let me go through them here. Scott has more of a comment. He says Samuel Fowler, once a tenant on Phillips Manor, moved to Newburgh, New York, and became a loyalist that was suspected in a plot to kidnap Governor Clinton.
Okay.
Might have to track down all these loyalists from connected to Phillips Manor. Robert asks, can you comment about the loyalist politics between New York City versus the rest of the colonies? Because they seem quite different.
I would say that New York's loyalists probably had similar politics to those in other colonies, with the possible exception of Massachusetts. Massachusetts obviously had Thomas Hutchinson, Francis Bernard, and they were leading the loyalist movement there, and they were certainly more authoritarian than the Delanceys. But in other colonies, you would need to do more research on this, but I would suspect that they are similar to the Delanceys in their. And what I mean by that is in their shared opposition to the coercive acts or the Tea Act or things like that. I would suspect they're similar in that sense. And then how they wanted to protest, whether using the assembly or other means, that might be where they differ. But overall, I would say they were quite similar.
All right, and I think we kind of answered this one a little bit, but Mary asks, were there many families that had members on both sides?
Yeah, I've seen people on both sides. Some genuine, and like it caused you every now and then you'll come across a quite vivid document about families separating as some stay and some go to the Maritimes in Canada, or you see just someone's name and you know that person is from a family that has a lot of patriots. A good example is the Oath of Allegiance that was tendered in Manhattan in 1777. Has Peter Vanbrugh Livingston Jr. I showed Peter Vanbrugh Livingston Sr. earlier. His son took the Oath of Allegiance in New York, and it's like, huh, was it just because he was there that he felt he had to do it, or was it because he was actually considered himself a loyalist? Obviously, there's some prominent examples like Benjamin Franklin and his son. That's kind of extreme, but for most people, I think it might have been pretty common. But every now, as I said, you do find some pretty extreme documents of people being almost like heartbroken when one member of their family has to leave and some stay because of their politics.
So I think the Coldens also. Isn't Caldwell Colden III a patriot and the rest of his family is loyalist?
I think so.
Yeah.
Well, Cadwallader Colden Jr. has a torrid time.
Yeah. I think also Henry Knox, General Henry Knox, his wife, Lucy Flecker, her family were quite prominent loyalists in Boston.
Yeah.
And they basically disown her when she marries Henry Knox. In part because he's a poor bookseller and comes from this super wealthy family, but also because he's a patriot and so she ends up with him. They get the last laugh though, because her whole family has to leaves during the revolution. And so she is the only Flecker left standing, and she inherits the Waldo patent, which is basically most of Maine. So that's where they end up. But yeah, it's the other, I'm interested. There's not been a ton of research done on the Phillipses post-revolution, and the only Phillips who is not named in the Act of Attainder is Philip Phillips, who's Frederick III's brother, and that's because he dies in 1768. But his kids and wife are not named in the Act of Attainder, so we're trying to figure out where, like, the story is like, oh, well, they were too young to decide which side to join, and so that's why they weren't named. But I just found out that the eldest son, who I think is also a Frederick Phillips, turned 21 in like 1775. So he would have been of age.
He's old enough.
Trying to figure out what happened there, and did the family stay, and where did they end up? So
that sounds exciting.
Yeah, lots of really cool research to be done in loyalist history. So what's your next project now that the book is done and published? Are you going to take a break?
Yeah, I'm taking a little break. I'm exploring John Adams's journey from Boston to the Continental Congress, in particular when he stayed in New York and the impact that had on creating intercolonial cooperation. That's coming along quite slowly, because sort of in my day job, like I work for the Papers of George Washington and Naval Documents of the American Revolution, so I've been working on that. I'm also doing some research on Black and Indigenous soldiers at the Battle of Trenton, which I'm enjoying a great deal. It's quite challenging, but I've been able to identify probably over 24 Black and Indigenous soldiers who participated, and I'm trying to essentially place them at the battle. Like, I found out what division they're in or what regiment they're in, and I'm trying to kind of track their journey from crossing the Delaware or not to Trenton. And I've been exploring veterans' pension records. So someone will quite often say, oh, I fought at the Battle of Trenton, I served in this regiment. And then when you look at the order of battle, it's like, no, you didn't fight at the Battle of Trenton because you weren't able to cross. But it's interesting because they're trying to kind of beef up their service by saying they fought at Trenton. They were certainly they could say they were at Trenton, but that is a kind of historical memory and what that means, because obviously these people were much older and they might misremember. But saying that they fought at Trenton is a good indicator of like how people viewed the significance of the battle. So I've been doing some research on that as well.
So those are all Patriot soldiers?
Yeah. I tried to identify any Black Hessians, but I wasn't able to find any.
We've been doing research on the Phillipsburg Proclamation.
I read the post on it.
Yeah, so we have 2 posts now. So the next one, which is the hardest one, is researching the impact of it, and also I found some references that the Black Pioneers was a regiment created by Sir Henry Clinton, and supposedly Beverly Robinson commanded it. So I'm trying to find out more information about the Black Pioneers, but because nothing is digitized, it's very slow going.
Yeah.
Because New York State will not pay me to go to Michigan and look at the Henry Clinton papers. So we'll see how far we get, but that's the goal.
That's exciting. If there's anything I can do to support your work, let me know.
Thanks, Chris. I appreciate it. All right. Well, it is 8:30, so this is my last call. If there's any other questions, this is your last chance to ask. We could take maybe one more. Anybody? Type quickly. Well, I will tell you that our next lecture, we're actually skipping October because our speaker for October is no longer available, but our next lecture will be in November, on November 8th. We'll have Justin Wexler talking about Munsee people in the Hudson Valley. So we're quite excited for that, for Native American Heritage Month. So that will be both in person and virtual. So we hope you guys will be able to join us. And I don't think we have any other questions. So thank you so much, Chris. This was super fun, super interesting. We had great questions from those of you who stayed with us. You can hear my cricket, who's been accompanying me all evening. And for those of you who missed the beginning, we did record it, so we'll get it up on YouTube eventually. And you can also check out our other recorded lectures on our YouTube channel. So with that, I think I'm going to end the meeting. Thanks so much, everybody, for joining us. Thanks so much, Chris, for doing such a great job. And hopefully we'll see you all next time.
Thanks.
Good night.